I do think this is a central debate, right? That's affecting what we invest in and what we prioritize in is, how much of space is, this relationship of space and warfare. How much is space going to be, primarily a domain to support terrestrial warfare, and how much of it is going to be a domain for warfare itself?
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Hey there, podcasters. This week's episode is your primer on the state of the U.S. military space budget, and it's before the House and the Senate reconvene for what's likely going to be a slugfest over the entire defense budget. And space business are well caught up in it. The clock runs out on the current fiscal year on September 30th. So for the government to remain open, both chambers will need to vote in favor of a continuing resolution to keep the lights on while the Senate and the House negotiate. The good news is that both the Senate and House leadership have agreed to push through a bill that does just that when they all return this September. Now, both the House and the Senate passed their defense authorization bills in July that surpass $886 billion and are above what the president asked for in defense discretionary funding. Both of the bills target a defense space top line of more than $31 billion. But that's about $1 billion below the president's proposal, and most of that accounting difference is coming out of what could be the budget for the U.S. Space Force. And the disparities don't end there. How the Senate and the House allocate their $31 billion also diverge. To unravel what's important to know, we've got Chris Stone, Peter Garretson, and Sam Wilson. We're going to take a look at DoD space. So that's including Space Force, the National Reconnaissance Office, anything that is defense and space related. Here's our conversation. Hello and welcome back, Chris, Peter, and Sam.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Laura, nice to be back.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Now, I seem to always have you guys on for the very meaty discussions. So before we take out the forks and knives and cut into the different budgets the House and Senate are serving up, prior to them hammering out a compromise, that is, let's do a quick round of introductions. And Chris, I always have you start.
Well, thanks. My name is Christopher Stone. I am a senior fellow for space deterrence at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm a former special assistant to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. And like many of these guys, I write fairly prolifically. So looking forward to the discussion.
And Peter?
I'm Peter Garretson. I'm a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council, and I've written a couple of books on space policy that are pretty current. Scramble for the Skies, and the second one is The Next Space Race, both of which are now available on Audible for you commuters.
And Sam, what about you?
Hi, I'm Sam Wilson. I'm with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, where I run our national security team. And I write slowly, so not as prolifically as Chris and Peter.
Thank you guys very much. There's billions to talk about. We're going to sidestep the department-wide top lines and jump right into the fact that the Biden administration asked for $32.4 billion for most of the easily identifiable defense space expenditures. That's Space Force, all the other service branches, then their space-related expenditures, as well as the agencies. Both the Senate and the House versions of the defense budget bill cut out more than $1 billion from President Biden's request. And most of that is coming out of the Space Force. And according to my very limited math skills, the Senate and the House want to keep next year's growth in defense space spending to just above 6%. And that's in contrast to what the administration asked for, which was a 10% bump. And my accounting includes adjustments for inflation. The Space Force is new and its responsibilities are growing, aren't they? I mean, all the other branches are continuing to develop the ways in which they use and depend on space capabilities. And well, it's not really like our adversaries, specifically China. It's not like they've agreed to a timeout on developing their defense space technologies. So, Sam, what's behind this thinking? You're the number one budget expert here.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the top line for what the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, what their bills were for Space Force. It looks very similar, right? But within that, what they actually cut is very different. So the SAC, the Senate Appropriations Committee, cut the polar program pretty significantly for the missile warning and tracking capability. They also cut the NC3 strategic SATCOM capability pretty significantly. So those two cuts were like 550 million right there, right? And then they actually increased funding for things like commercial space. They increased funding for classified RDT&E. And that budget line, I think, is really interesting if you think about the House and the Senate, because the difference between the House and the Senate bill for that budget line is almost 700 million, right? So just that budget line is almost 700 million difference between the two. So even though they get to the same figure, they got there through different ways, right? The Senate increased a lot and then cut a lot, whereas the House was a little bit more, it was closer to what the administration requested. It was more modest cuts, and as well as a significant cut to the classified RDT&E. And when I say RDT&E, that initialism is research, development, testing, and evaluation. That appropriation is 60% of Space Force's budget, and that's been consistent with years past. And that kind of speaks to the nature of Space Force being mostly focused on complex hardware, right, rather than heavy procurement or O&M or military personnel.
Guys, well, then what cuts relative to what the president has asked for have the House or the Senate identified that you believe are problematic? I mean, what should these legislators perhaps reconsider? Because they're going to go into conference and none of this is really set in stone yet. And Peter, why don't you kick this one off?
Well, obviously, I start worrying principally about the seed corn of where long-term innovation and disruption is going to come from. And so it's disturbing to me when I look and see that really, really novel things like space solar power Spider looks like it's getting as much as 15 million cut. Rocket cargo losing between 12 to 25 million, which is like a third to a half of its tiny budget. And then if you're trying to increase the importance of the combatant command, Space Command's tiny R&D support, they're losing like a third of that. DARPA's Draco looks like it's down about 13%. And then like this new long-range kill chains also looks like it might be losing 20%. And then when you look at sort of classified programs, so the one that's just called classified looks like it could go anywhere. So, last year's presidential budget request was $5 billion, and this time it's up to almost 5.7, and it could either go down as much as 178, or it could go up as much as $500 million, depending on whether or not which of the two committees gets their way in committee. And then there's also, under the classified special activities, they're losing like $500 million. And so you wonder, in the attempt to get ahead in here, just how secure are we in those areas?
I'll add something here, Peter. I personally think that a lot of this goes back to with the president's budget request, and on the Senate side being fairly much in lockstep with the president's budget request, because usually whichever side controls the Senate, if they're matching the White House, they typically don't want to rock the boat too much, whereas the House may have a little bit of tendency to go a little more aggressive one way or the other, especially if they're the opposing party. But when you look at the current policy of the space priorities framework, it sees military space as enable and support, and most of the programs that have any type of plus up whatsoever is mostly that kind of a thing. It's all the support infrastructure that we've been doing for the last 40, 50 years, and all the stuff that Peter mentioned, like rocket cargo and Draco nuclear thermal propulsion and the classified special programs, which I'm hoping is where the hard and soft kill that the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Space Operations mentioned earlier in the year during the markup phase is probably at. And you're showing basically to the world that we're cutting the Space Force's budget, which is already the smallest of any of the services. You're basically whittling down the U.S. Space Command, as Peter mentioned, down to not being able to advance any real causes. And on top of that, you're seeing both leaders of the service and the combatant command basically seemingly falling in or being restrained or constrained by this enable and support, where they change the unified command plan into the primary mission is terrestrial support and not protecting and defending, deterring, and if needed, warfighting in space to protect our infrastructure. And so this is just sort of my starter point on the big picture, because I think this is what we're seeing in the budget is, what's most important. And to the current folks, they're not really sure what to do with it. And the RDT&E may be going up a little bit, as Sam mentioned, in the classified side for RDT&E, but it seems like we never get out of the RDT&E lane when it comes to counter space systems or other special things that we needed 10 years ago. And we're still constantly having to fight the battle, as you see in some of the rationale for these cuts is like under executed, basically, or not making a good enough case, things of that sort. And a lot of that's just based on the opinions or on the lack of information that's given to the committees by the administration's representatives in the DoD. So there's a lot to talk about in that, and I don't know if we'll go into that, but that's just something that I see that concerns me about some of the stuff that Peter's mentioned. It's coming from policy, and you're seeing that manifest itself in dollars.
If I can jump in, Laura, I would just note, I do think this is a central debate, right? That's affecting what we invest in and what we prioritize in is, how much of space is, this relationship of space and warfare. How much is space going to be, primarily a domain to support terrestrial warfare, and how much of it is going to be a domain for warfare itself? And I think there's, where you land on that spectrum is going to impact kind of which types of investments you want to prioritize. I mean, the one thing that's clear to me, and one thing that's not cut in either the House or the Senate bills, is this broader push toward resiliency by moving to lower orbits and at higher numbers, right? Like this idea of we're going to have more systems, therefore they're going to be disincentivized from trying to attack our systems, because any attack is only going to take out a small percentage of the capability. That's been a real trend in what we've seen the Space Force invest in, and as well as what the House and the Senate have supported each year. One thing that's really interesting to me is, SDA's, the Space Development Agency's budget, from 4 years ago when they started, their budget based on this year's request would be an increase of 35 times what they initially got, right? Like, they have had tremendous budgetary success. And each year, Congress, in one of the two bills, one of the HACD or SACD bills, will say, hey, we're concerned about, how much this is costing. However, we're going to give you even more money than you asked for, right? Like consistently, the Senate, the Congress has been giving, for missile warning and tracking at LEO, for the transport layer, these big projects that are focused on really high numbers, low altitudes. They've been expressing concerns about the cost, but then yet giving SDA more money than what the administration requested. So I think it's a really, it's an interesting trend that we're seeing. And I think, it begs this question of, to your point, if the budget, the Space Force has received pretty significant budget increases over the last 4 years, right? Near doubling, $15.3 billion to $30.2 billion in this year's request, over 4 years, right? Like, what happens when that gets more stable, and how are some of these architectures, as they start growing and getting more expensive, how are we going to balance that with other priorities and other emergent priorities, right? That we're not even thinking about, we're not focused on right now.
And Sam, you also mentioned that the priorities, and as they're putting all their money into the low Earth orbit disaggregated things, they're taking vehicles out of the next gen OPIR at the geo level, and they're also cutting that program pretty substantial. And even so definitely Derek Turnier has been a very good salesman and a good spokesman for his concept, despite some of the things that I've been arguing, is that, everyone is jumping on the bandwagon and everyone's trying to copy each other, and they're ignoring or not thinking it matters that the Chinese are already looking at ways to counter that through concepts like system destruction, where they don't view it as hundreds of targets, they view it as one big target, and they have a multi-layered structure to deal with that. And by the way, just because if you put them lower, it's more in range of different weapon systems, whereas you have a little bit more cushion from various counter space activities at the MEO and GEO levels, which is part of the arguments that the next gen guys are probably giving. But yet they still lost one of their planned architecture satellites as they try to go that route. And whether Congress continues with some of the language of having a multi-layered approach to that and other systems, I'm not sure. But again, if we're not looking at what the adversary is doing, it may be the best sales pitch you can get, and it may be value added in the dollars, but if it's not what you need to do the mission for which the institutions were created for, we're kind of we're not in a good spot.
Yeah, and just want to jump on that as well, because Chris mentioned the UCP and what policy is coming in terms of support, and I really applauded your recent discussion on LinkedIn and your piece about if the Space Force isn't going to defend critical commercial infrastructure, then who's going to do that? And so I don't think that it is only a question of support or in-space warfare. I think it fundamentally is about competition itself in the space domain, maintaining a posture, very much an arms race kind of mentality of always making it uncertain. And so, there's this terrific, joint concept out on competing, from which I'm sure that the CSO probably took his theory of success, since it's defined in there. And there really could be more attention being paid to how you extend and push commercial out there and protect it, since that is one of the reasons we created the Space Force, is to protect America's interests in space.
I'd like to say, just for my part, the thing that kind of puts a pit in my stomach is what's happening with RDT&E, what's happening with science, what's happening with thinking not 10 years out, 10 years, 20 years out, 30 years out. What's the science that has to be done to do exactly what you were talking about there, Peter? Because it is a competition, and the competition is going to be won by those that become the masters of the physics that's going on out there. So that's where I have a pit in my stomach, and I guess I'll just go on to the next question here.
Well, before you do, I mean,
Sure.
there's some health in the budget, but of course, advanced R&D was cut 5%, and we've talked about some of the areas, where we know that disruptions can come, and at least, even though they're not putting the, as much money against the advanced stuff as we would like,
Or the
there's
classified stuff.
language in there that is talking, positively about nuclear thermal, nuclear electric. Then there's a ton of language on moving target indicators, which is interesting because both the Senate and House language specifically talks about that going so far as to say the Department of the Air Force is aggressively, going after, or the Space Force is aggressively going after a ground moving target indicator program. But of course, there's nothing that's called that by name in the budget.
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing about words. Back maybe 10 years ago now, in one of the earlier incarnations of documents that they called the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, there was a bunch of language in there that supported the seed corn, as Peter calls it, or space RDT&E, whether it's basic research, advanced research, and beyond. And yet, over the next 4 years, the president's budget request cut it each year by 20%. Now, over the last few years, there's been a little bit of bump in that. And part of the reason why you haven't, people have, that I've heard anyway, have told me, yeah, the reason why that happens is because the research in the government sphere is not really leading the way like it used to, and most of the innovation is coming on the commercial side, and therefore it's probably better to do more partnerships with commercial sector and leverage what's called IRAD, or industry research and development, as a way of getting ahead a lot faster. As we heard numerous times, that go faster mantra, which people usually say go where faster, but they never really quite say that. So as a result, that's
or
why you might
go
hear
into
some.
the valley of death faster. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
well,
part of the
that
issue,
too.
right?
Yeah, so just that's some of the rationale people might say to some of what we're discussing. And I am happy, as you know, to see all the nuclear thermal and nuclear electric stuff in there. It's just I'm kind of tired of them being in research and development when we've been researching and developing some of these types of technology since the 1960s. And it's like, can we build it now? Can we deploy something? I mean, I'm all for RDT&E, but can we move it beyond that? That would be great.
Absolutely, but let's look at a converse example, right? So there's the whole issue of commercial synthetic aperture radar, which is right there,
Yep.
right? We've got like
Yep.
at least 3 companies ready to provide it, and so we had this initial program where NGA, in partnership with NRO, started to walk down the path of putting out a carrot there for industry, and then it seems like they attempted to walk it back, to freeze out or limit the potential role of SAR, to rely on their own systems, in a way that could frankly devastate the industry. And it looks like Congress caught wind of this and essentially threatened the NRO, saying that hey, we could be giving this money to the Space Force ComSo if you don't want it.
And what's
And
the
then
ComSo?
so that is the brand new Space Force commercial office, which is looking. They certainly would like to have the ambition of buying all things commercial, and I think there's a lot of folks out in industry that frankly think at this point that the Space Force might be a more credible partner in the long term to buy commercial. But in any case, you can see that the intent of Congress is clearly, like, they have this language that says that they are encouraged to see NRO execute a service level agreement for electro-optical, and that they wanted to move into phenomenologies like synthetic aperture radar, radio frequency, hyperspectral. So it's very clear what direction Congress wants to push these ready on the shelf capabilities that Chris is talking about. And those are the companies you would think are in a position to innovate fast.
And I would just note, on the commercial front too. I mean, to be fair, the Space Force budget has been criticized for not more aggressively transitioning to commercial either, right? Like this has been something that's been a criticism of at least on the DoD side, DoD broadly, right? This is something that's been criticized, and the House and Senate bills have been also trying to push the Space Force to go more aggressively to go further with respect to exploiting commercial space technologies, including things like what Chris mentioned of actually just asking them to warn commercial providers if they're threats, as well as kind of increasing some of the funding. I mean, we haven't seen yet, and I think this is when we see it, it'll be really interesting, right? Like the COCOMs are using commercial space to a greater extent, but when we actually see foregoing traditional acquisition because we're relying much more heavily on commercial services, right? That's going to be a really crucial moment. And I think some outside observers have criticized DoD's budget that we haven't done that right yet, right? And there's a lot of opportunity, even though commercial space is getting used. Obviously, it's gotten a lot of attention. The thing I always point out when people say, well, now we're finally serious about using commercial space for national security. Look at all the leadership and DoD, Air Force, Space Force who are saying this. We have presidential documents saying exploit commercial space to the greatest extent practical, going back 40 years, right? And it hasn't happened yet. So this, there is, we're getting closer, I think, and I think there's a lot of opportunity right now, but we haven't fully exploited it yet.
By the way, on that note, it's interesting that Congress also weighed in and said, hey, good job thinking about this Civil Reserve space fleet, and we want to hear more. So put together, a briefing and tell us how you would set it up in this time-phased manner.
Yeah, well, I think that's and I'm sorry, Chris, I think that's a fascinating issue, right? Like this, and we've been thinking a lot about, this, how to leverage, how the government should think about leveraging commercial space in a conflict or crisis, and across the kind of spectrum of provocation. And there's a lot of different policy questions and policy choices that the government should think about, whether it's how to ramp up capabilities really fast, how to integrate them really quickly, how to ensure that they survive, right? Obviously the economy isn't what it was a couple of years ago with respect to venture capitalist investment. So, I think there's a lot of really, really good and important questions in the space community about how should DoD do this? And there's not, I think, a clear answer.
Well, one more thing before, I know Laura's been trying to get in, but because of what you said, Peter, how you mentioned the craft for space thing, Civil Reserve Air Fleet kind of thing, and the fact that Congress is interested in that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, because you mentioned my editorial about protecting commercial, with the commander of U.S. Space Command essentially saying to commercial providers, I haven't been told to protect you, so deal with it. Even though to me that's an implied task that he has as part of his marching order, whether it's his number 2 priority and not his number 1 priority, it's still an implied task, whether he has something in writing signed by the president or the secretary. So it's kind of weird when you have, we support you out of one side of your mouth, and then out of the other side of your mouth, yeah, we support you to provide us with stuff, but we're not going to protect it because we're putting all of our money into modernizing support infrastructure and not enough into finding that balance. I think Peter mentioned a balance where you have the ability to protect these things, because if you can't protect them, because the adversary, China in particular, is working on ways to deny that and destroy that, all of it, the all sorts of different constellations that we need. If you don't have that stuff protected, it's not going to provide any services for you. So you're kind of defeating yourself.
Yeah, I want to jump
decisions.
in here. because,
I
when we
used to
talk
have a
about protection,
podcast.
when we talk about protection, right, people seem to think that this means that I've got to have a Guardian satellite sitting up next to, every Starlink satellite, protecting it from some, would-be grappler, or somehow, providing them, with tools that would stop, cyber EW mischief. But, let me just point out that we don't hold that kind of high bar to protection of commercial assets in other domains. There is absolutely nothing that is going to stop, a surface-to-air missile from shooting down an American jet, other than knowledge that Air Force bombers might be coming for your next. And there is pretty much nothing that the Navy can do to stop our oil tankers, our LNG tankers, our container ships from being hit by a shore to sea missile or get sunk by a submarine, right? What the way that we protect those is, basically by a demonstrated willingness to do tit for tat and to hurt back. And so, I actually think the case is much stronger. I certainly understand that the active protection, as in a defended asset list for one particular thing, rests with a presidential decision. Okay, I'm not going to disagree that that's the way it should be. But in terms of public talking points, as you and I were conversing on LinkedIn, it's absolutely unimaginable that the Indo-PACOM commander, would say, "Hey, if the president hasn't told me to protect a commercial ship, it's fair game." And so, I don't think it's even an implied task. I think when the Space Force and Space Command, the Space Force is legally constituted to protect America's interests in space, I don't see how you can even say that that's an implied task. That's an absolutely specified task.
I was trying to be generous, but I agree with you totally. Back to you, Laura.
All right. Gaining control back just for a few seconds, I'm sure. Chris, you're known for being so full of sunshine with your critical position and, on this podcast and in op-eds. So this would usually be a really tough question for you. But what in either the Senate and House versions do you like? And I've got to tell you that when I read the House bill language about nuclear electric space propulsion, I thought of you and maneuver warfare.
Yes. Yes, that is definitely one thing I am happy about. And I'm not all critical all the time. I have mentioned positive things when I see them. And so, yeah, the provision for nuclear electric, I think, is interesting, given the mention that the Draco, which was mentioned by Peter, is nuclear thermal, which is leveraging uh, low enriched uranium rather than highly enriched uranium to power the core. And that's supposed to be tested in orbit for the first time ever in like 26, 25 timeframe. But nuclear electric is new. And the reason why it's become of interest to Congress, as they say in their own document, is nuclear thermal is good for propelling things fairly rapidly and lasting a long time, because it's a lot more efficient than chemical propulsion. It's a lot quicker than electric propulsion. But nuclear electric just means that it has the nuclear power to not only power its propulsion system, but a lot of potential military payloads that can be carried on whatever the ship is, or the satellite that it's pushing around. So whether it's protecting cislunar space, or being able to respond to issues, or to send things out for an exploratory mission, nuclear electric provides the ability for power and propulsion that you can't get from a more traditionally designed, chemically propelled, solar or fuel cell based power system. And if they can get that through, that would be great. I'm a fan of either of them, because, as you mentioned, I did write a paper a year or two ago about how that can help facilitate the ability to counter Chinese maneuver warfare, or mobile warfare, as they call it, capabilities that they're looking at in the near term, not long term, in the next decade plus for cislunar activities and being able to transit between key orbital regimes in a lot less time than the standard days, weeks, and months, depending on the type of propulsion system you have and the types of innovative orbital maneuvering you use. This allows you to get there a lot faster. So I'm very happy to see that. I am happy to see, as was mentioned also, that they didn't zero out completely rocket cargo and some of these other programs, because while a lot of people look at them as science fiction because they're not used to that being around and they think it's kind of crazy, Peter, I think as a former cargo plane pilot, knows how expensive flying things around the earth is and how expensive shipping things by sea is. And when people need things rapidly, air has been sort of the high end, high expense way to get it there fairly quickly. But now with the ability to do rocket cargo, once they start testing it and improving it out with Starship or whatever system they use as a model, I think that's something that'll be great, not only for Earth-based issues, logistics and whatnot, but also for the lunar economic growth that's potentially coming, as many reputable financial institutions are speaking to, upwards of several $1 trillion of worth and value, that being able to get there first is something that's going to be very important. So I was very happy to see that. So that's a positive.
And Peter, Sam, did you see anything in there that made you say, okay, well, there are all these things that bug me, but this is actually pretty good?
Well, the big thing, of course, I'm super happy that at least in the House, we've got a Space National Guard. So I definitely like that. I also, it's hard not to notice Congress sort of stroking the DoD for doing the right things. On commercial, it's very clear, that like the number of times that cislunar is mentioned in both is quite significant. It's good to see interest in power and propulsion, which is terrific. And ISAM, it's interesting. They even had a request for a study looking at nuclear power in excess of 2 megawatts, which I think is terrific. So I think the talking points are increasingly sort of converging on the sort of things that those of us who have been around for a long time have sort of been pushing, saying like, hey, here's where the innovation could be, invest here. And of course, I'd like to see, that get funded more, but I think it's really nice to see that the language is, starting to push and anticipate where I think we're going to get more future investment. And I just to foot stomp, what Chris was saying, I absolutely think that, you cannot solely be focused on this vertical component of space power. You have to be thinking about space, as an archipelago of islands, where the moon is the next major, part of our economic sphere, and where the Space Force is going to play a key role in making, that a safe and secure place for commerce. And I'd like to see a lot more of that in the talking points, particularly in the posture statements.
Laura, if I can mention really quickly 3 things.
You can mention whatever you want, Sam.
Well, I mean, I wasn't part of the LinkedIn chain where Chris and Peter were just like complimenting each other and each other's work. So I feel really left out. Next time you'll have to let me know. So 3 things, 2 things that I think are good, and something that I thought was striking and just notable that I wanted to bring up. One is something that's good on the SAC-D side is, I think, the emphasis on commercial and trying to push the Space Force to use commercial to a greater extent. Something on the House side has nothing to do with actually the budget numbers itself, but could be really important for the budget. Is there's this measure that didn't receive a lot of attention, that they would have for next year have a new budget exhibit that would be built around capability areas and portfolio areas. And this isn't just to make them do more work, but this is really kind of a test to see what could happen if we gave the services a little bit more control, a little bit more flexibility based on mission area rather than budget line, right? And I think that is really intriguing and really interesting and can change how it could be the starting point for how the services start maybe change the way they budget and slightly change this relationship that we've seen. So I think that's super significant. Hasn't gotten a lot of headlines, but really probably one of the most important things in any of these bills. The thing that I think is striking, both in the Senate and House side, and frankly with the administration's request, was how much change is on space-based nuclear command and control. And I'm biased because before working on space, I was focused on nuclear weapons issues and a lot of space-based NC3. And this budget, if you look at some of the biggest budget lines, it's next generation space-based areas focused on either missile warning and tracking, which we've talked a lot about, and strategic SATCOM, which is in making sure that leadership has connectivity in a nuclear conflict, can reach its nuclear forces in a nuclear conflict. These two areas, missile warning and strategic SATCOM, consume a big piece of the Space Force's budget. And there's also the budget lays out how the next generation programs are going to be a lot different than their predecessors. On the missile warning and tracking side, obviously, we've already talked about the LEO and MEO architectures. Missile warning has always been in high orbits, always been in geo and polar. So this transition and what that means for NC3 is really important. HACD brought this up in their criticism of the analysis supporting the decision to cut the third geo bird. On the Senate side, they've been trying to cut the polar side for a while, right? So there's this really interesting question about how does NC3 change as we move into this fundamentally new architecture, missile warning and tracking. On the strategic SATCOM side, that's also changing in a way that also hasn't grabbed as many headlines. But, traditionally, our satellites that have supported nuclear command and control with respect to comms have always served two missions: nuclear forces and conventional forces. The same satellites are designed to communicate with our ballistic missile submarines, as well as with Army brigade combat teams, right? Same satellites. That's changing with the next generation systems. We're splitting apart those satellites so that it's PTS, which is going to be the tactical program designed for conventional comms, and ESS, Evolved Strategic SATCOM, which is focused on the strategic side. That received a big cut in the Senate Appropriations Committee bill. But what's interesting to me isn't just the cut, but just how this is different from the past. And there's been a long debate about this has been talked about since 2010, even probably earlier, but of trying to cut the strategic SATCOM program into specifically strategic SATCOM capabilities that only speak to nuclear forces versus having separate satellites talk to conventional forces. But part of the rationale here, part of the argument has always been, kind of going to Chris's earlier point, has been about space warfighting, right? And the idea has been, if an adversary is going to attack our system that's doing conventional comms, we don't want that to also be the capability that's doing nuclear comms, right? And we don't want to sort of inadvertently, have an adversary inadvertently undermine our nuclear command and control. So anyway, this divide between PTS and ESS, with ESS being the first ever U.S. strategic SATCOM program not designed to talk to conventional tactical forces, I think is really important and hasn't gotten enough attention.
And now I want to kind of revisit something that was brought up earlier, and that is the Space National Guard. The House, for the second year in a row, has legislated the creation of a Space National Guard. The Senate seems to want to kick the can down the road by asking for another report due after the close of the president's current term. And the president is dead set against it. So, gentlemen, Will this be the year that we actually see a Space National Guard?
Well, I'll start off by saying that I think it's actually the third year that the House has supported this, because we've seen that since at least before 2019, which was the FY20 NDAA, that they ignored it the first year just to get the Space Force out of the building there. The 21, 22, and 23 all had House support, but not Senate support. What we've seen over the last several years is a slowly increasing in support on the Senate side, a more solid support on the House side, and because, as I mentioned earlier, unless it's just something unique, if the party in the Senate that controls the Senate is matching up with the guy or girl in the White House, party wise, then they typically don't want to go against something that they're that strongly about in their statements of administration policy. So I don't think we'll see it this year unless something happens to where they want to trade, the House wants to trade something with the Senate for it. Because if it's not mentioned in some form in both bills, it typically doesn't survive first contact in conference committee. And I mean, anything can happen, and I would like to see it happen. But with lots of different things going on, where the president's threatened vetoes of the NDAA, which is kind of a no-no, toward the military bill. I'm not seeing it. I'm hoping, but I'm not seeing it yet. So I think the studies, as we keep seeing every year, those are tools put in by supporters to try to keep the discussion alive another year, even though this issue has been studied to death for numerous years and multiple times per year. So the study, I don't think, is because they don't have the answers. I think it's a legislative tactic to keep the discussion open and not allow the Guard space missions to be absorbed or destroyed for another year. We'll see.
Well, I am also hopeful. I think it's unfortunate, and I hope that the Senate would not kick the can down the road and leave a significant amount of the Space Force's warfighting capabilities orphaned in the Air Force, which increasingly, you can tell is uncomfortable having those. Unclear whether or not they have the proper authorities to maintain them, and so. But whether or not they'll be able to do it with a hostile White House, this year remains to be seen. I don't know who put in the study, but I will say the opposite scenario of what Chris laid out happens too, which is that those in favor of kicking the can down the road who aren't, are will compromise and give something, or give the appearance of forward action. Now, the good thing is that actually, ultimately did result in forward action for the Space Force. The Senate did exactly the same thing. The House said, let's go with the Space Corps. The Senate said, not so fast. I'm not convinced we really need this. Let's have a study. And of course, they eventually came around. So it's also not unusual for the Senate to be a bit slow when it comes to understanding, what must be done with military organization.
It's how they were designed. They were supposed to be a deliberative body, but sometimes a little too deliberative, maybe in some cases. This is probably one of those that seems to make a lot of sense to a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. So, but we shall see in probably October or November, since we'll probably not have a full bill.
No, we're going to be on continuing resolutions.
Probably.
All right.
Yeah.
And Sam, you look like you're about to say something.
I was just going to say, don't say that, Laura. Let's have good mojo kind of going into this. Fingers crossed.
I completely agree. And lastly, what do we think about the announcement that Space Command is allegedly staying in Colorado? Peter, I know that you had a view towards this.
I am frankly shocked that they would make that decision and risk getting the chairman of the House Armed Services, uh, you know, as well as senators from Alabama, you know, so irked at them, and in such a position to hurt the Department of the Air Force in so many ways. And I don't see any possibility that Alabama is going to back down on this. So I hardly think that the declaration of the operational capability is the end of the story. This strikes me. I'm sure many of your listeners have seen the new Top Gun, and of course, you remember that Tom Cruise was up there pushing it, trying to get to Mach 10 before they shut down his program. So I think this is sort of the Pyrrhic victory that we've seen, where they have sped as fast as they can to get to IOC in order to claim that that is the reason why they can't move to one of the top 4 things that actually went through the committee. So I'm not convinced at all.
And just say what IOC is for those who don't know.
Sorry, it's is it IOC or is it FOC? It's
IOC. Yeah. It's initial operating capability is what they claim they have now.
Right.
And the argument is that if you want to get to full operating capability or FOC, then moving it will cause problems. And as I mentioned in a LinkedIn post of an article about that the whole argument that they had toward keeping it in Colorado, as Peter said, was, oh, if you move the command, then that'll affect readiness and mission ability. Well, in reality, Colorado is not where everything is right now. When Space Command was stood up in 2019, and it's basically fractionated between 3 main locations. There's still pieces in Omaha, Nebraska at Strategic Command. There's pieces in Colorado Springs, and there's pieces out in California. And the whole point of the decision initially to move it to Redstone Arsenal was because there's lots of land there to build upon, but also because you need a place to put everything into one location so that the commander has access to all of his staff members and not having to rely on video teleconference and all that kind of stuff. So the fact that they're saying, that the command will be uprooted and mission won't be able to be done is kind of false, because the transition between Stratcom and U.S. Space Command with 3 different locations, the mission did not stop during the transition of the mission from Omaha, Nebraska to Colorado Springs as a provisional headquarters. So the idea that moving everything over time, because it's going to take a few years to get the military construction funding and everything else going, the idea that that's somehow going to hinder full operating capability of essentially an office building with some command centers, the forces themselves are not based there. This is a building of leadership, planners, and people like that. It's important to have a headquarters for the generals and his staff, but the mission is not going to stop being done just because it doesn't move to one place or the other. So I didn't buy that argument, and the fact that that's still being used is odd to me. So, but as Peter says, I don't think Mike Rogers, the House Armed Services Committee chair, is just going to go, okay, whatever. He's already doing an investigation on it that was happening before the president made his decision to reverse everything after 2 different studies over 3 different election cycles. That's
Which
what
is
I think.
Odd too, because I really do think that when the Air Force does their installation review, I think they're trying as hard as possible to be apolitical in their scoring. Now, whether or not the scoring criteria itself, is something that you agree or disagree on. I mean, this argument, is sort of in many ways not unlike those who were opposing the Space Force, saying we're just too busy right now. I mean, if we take time out to have a new headquarters for a Space Force, it'll compromise our readiness and we'll get behind. So, it's a question of like what's going to ultimately be better for you in the long term. And there are arguments both ways. There are folks who say, hey, it's a great thing that somebody from Space Command can walk next door to Space Force. Others say it's incredibly stupid to put all your space command and control stuff in the same place. And there are other folks who say it contributes to groupthink. And then there are all those questions about lifestyle and cost which is, I think, one of the big reasons why they were favoring Huntsville, was that the cost of housing there was apparently attractive.
All right, gentlemen. Well, then that's all the time we have. And thank you all so much for coming back.
Thanks again.
Thanks for having me again. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura.
That's it for this week. If you like what you're hearing, follow the downlink on Twitter and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. For the latest defense news and analysis, listen to the Daily Defense and Aerospace Report podcast hosted by Vago Muradian, and listen to Cavis Ships to hear the latest on what's happening in the maritime domain. I'm Laura Winter, and thank you for listening.